Welcome to Letter to Philippi Live, our daily broadcast from Letter to Philippi, looking at Paul's letter to the Philippians. My name is Sean Emslie. I'll be your teacher of this class, and I'm the founder of Letter to Philippi, a new Messianic Jewish theological teaching organization. Again, welcome to Letter to Philippi for those who are just joining us, and we'll be starting today looking at Philippians chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, as we begin the fourth chapter of Paul's letter to the Philippians. Today we'll be looking, as I said, at Philippians 4, 1 through 3, as Paul begins the conclusion of his letter and also deals with an issue of disunity within the community of Philippi between two of the leaders in the community, Euodia and Syntyche. And he will be encouraging them to come together and encouraging the leaders in the community to come together to bring these women into unity for the sake of the unity in the whole Messianic community in Philippi. So we'll begin with a word of prayer, and then we'll go into our study for today. Oh Lord, you're good. We thank you. We bless your holy name. We thank you for each time we can look into your holy word, Lord. We thank you for your holy servant, Paul. We thank you, Lord, that we have these words given to us to help us to understand you more and to learn to become more and more and more in the Messiah. Help that to be our task today, and help that to be our result today, to become more and more like you. We thank you for this day. We thank you for the Messiah who is our life. And we look forward to your holy Shabbat, which is coming later today. And we thank you in the name of Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen. So again, this is Letter to Philippi Live. My name is Sean Emslie. I'm your teacher. And today we'll be looking at Philippians chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, as we continue looking at Paul's letter to the Philippians daily, Monday through Friday, 12 p.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Phoenix time, 2 p.m. Chicago time, 3 p.m. Orlando time, and 10 p.m. Jerusalem time. And we'll be looking at Philippians chapter 4, verses 1 through 3 today. And I'll give you a brief introduction of this chapter, then we'll start looking at verse 1. So we're now into Philippians chapter 4. And Philippians chapter 4 is the final chapter of the letter in which Paul addresses the letter, one of the letter's underlining purposes. Chapter 4, as I said, there are many different themes, there are many different issues that Paul deals with his letter, which, as I said, has caused some scholars to believe there's multiple letters that were actually edited together. So one of the underlining themes, one of the underlying purposes of the letter was the issue of division among leaders in the community, which Paul addresses here, and we'll be looking at in chapter 4. Throughout the letter, Paul stresses that disunity is grounded in a lack of humility. Humility is the overriding theme throughout the book of Philippians. And Paul here is calling people in Philippi to understand that lack of humility leads to disunity in the community, disunity between individuals, as we'll see between Euodia and Syntyche. And then it could spread to become disunity among the whole Messianic community. So here calls these leaders, Euodia and Syntyche, and the other leaders in the community to return to unity grounded in modeling the Messiah's example of humility and self-sacrifice. This chapter, as we'll see, will also include familiar verses on joyful living, as follows Yeshua in verse 6, focusing on good things, rejecting evil thoughts in verse 8, and divine empowerment for works of service to God in verse 13. Paul concludes this letter with gratitude to the Philippians for their faithful financial and physical support of his ministry, and with words of encouragement and blessing. Indeed, Paul's beloved community of Philippi encouraged him also at the inception of his work, spreading the good news of the Messiah throughout Europe and to the ends of the earth in the first century of the Common Era. So there are many different issues that Paul will be dealing in this final chapter, sharing about this disunity in the community, giving us words of encouragement in our faith, and also thanking the Philippians for their support of him, both financially and physically. So we now get into verse 1, and I'll put that up on the screen here. And we read, "So my brothers, whom I love and long for, my joy and my crown, my dear friends, keep standing firm in union with the Lord." Let me read that again. "So my brothers, whom I love and long for, my joy and my crown, my dear friends, keep standing firm in union with the Lord. Paul here, as he's concluding this letter to the Philippians, and he'll soon, as I said in the next two verses, be dealing with an issue of disunity in the community. He calls people in Philippi, and by example, that for us to stand in firm union with the Lord, that our unity with the Messiah, our unity with the Messiah will lead us to be in union with one another. That as we all seek to be in union with the Lord, in union with the Messiah, that we can stand together in unity. And he calls in this chapter for there to be unity in the community among these two leaders, and then as example throughout the whole community, to live as one together, as one family of God, or one family seeking to follow the Messiah of Israel. As the victor in athletic competition would receive a prize, usually an olive branch or crown, Paul considers the relationship and ministry of the Philippians to be his prize for faithful service and his great source of joy in his final days. Paul shares that the Philippians are a great joy to him, and he loves them so deeply. And despite his suffering and impending execution, he can rejoice in their faith in Yeshua, and their growing more like the Messiah is a spiritual reward, a crown for their and his faithfulness to God. So Paul here is speaking here about his deep love for the Philippians and how their faithfulness to God, their standing firm in union with the Lord, is a great joy to him and a crown for his service. That his striving for the Messiah has been rewarded in their faithfulness to the Messiah. And as he's looking now to the end of his life coming soon, he can enjoy and look at, though he suffered much for the Messiah, that he has great joy that the people of Philippi got the message of the Messiah, lived out the message of the Messiah, and can be a great joy to him as he's concluding his many years of service to the Messiah. In verse 2, we begin into looking at the issue of disunity in the community. We read, I beg Evodia and I beg Syntyche to agree with each other in union with the Lord. Let me read that again. I beg Evodia and I beg Syntyche to agree with each other in union with the Lord. As Paul concludes this letter, he mentions the possible primary reason for this letter, confronting the disunity in the community because of the disagreement between Evodia and Syntyche, two women leaders in the Messianic community in Philippi, people that he will call fellow workers, two women who were in leadership among the Yeshua believers in Philippi. Paul knew conflicts among the leaders would be detrimental to the community, and therefore he took this opportunity in this letter to confront division between two prominent women in Philippi. As he concluded this letter, as he shared about his love for the community, he shared without them the centrality of Yeshua in their life and how Yeshua should be their master and king and the focus of all their life. He's now, as he concludes this letter, is coming to deal with this issue of disunity among Evodia and Syntyche, two prominent women in the Philippian community, two women in roles of responsibility and leadership within the community. Paul uses the word parakaleo, meaning beg, urge, exhort, appeal to, showing the importance of this issue to him, that he's begging these women to come together in unity, for he's calling them, urging them, exhorting them, appealing to them in this deep language for them to come together and to put aside whatever issue is separating them for their own sake, for their own spiritual walk, and also for the health of the community itself. Because with these two women of prominence, they could be people taking sides. Well, I'm on Evodia's side, I'm on Syntyche's side, and it could split up the Messianic community in Philippi. It could split up our Messianic communities today if there's conflict between those who are in leadership and people take sides. Well, I'm with Harold, or I'm with Joseph, or whatever it would be, whatever the people that we're taking sides for. But like this here, Paul is calling Evodia and Syntyche. He's begging them for them to come together and to come together in unity and to model the Messiah-like humility and self-sacrifice that he's been speaking about throughout this whole book, which has been a running theme throughout the book, that for the disciple of Yeshua to model the Messiah, you need to model in humility and self-sacrifice. Throughout this letter, Paul's been dealing with the importance of humility, with positive examples of himself in chapter 1, the ultimate example of humility, Yeshua, our righteous Messiah, in chapter 2, Timothy and Epaphroditus also in chapter 2, and giving, as Dr. Stern said to us, a negative example of humility, the pride of the false teachers in chapter 3. And Paul here is emphasizing that humility leads to unity. For there to be unity in the Messianic community, there needs to be humility among the leaders and in the people, that the whole community modeling the humility and self-sacrifice of the Messiah. Paul sheds light on the issue of pride and lack of humility in the relation of Evodian and Syntyche, which not only affected them, but also was an issue of concern for the whole Philippian Messianic community. So Paul is confronting this disagreement between these two women, these two prominent women in the Messianic community of Philippi, that he calls fellow workers with him in the gospel. So they had a place of prominence, they had a place of service, a place of leadership within the community, and their disunity could affect the whole Messianic community. So Paul here, as I said, is using the Greek word for beg or urge, calls them to come together. Paul twice used the Greek word phroneo, which means referring specifically to the attitude of people to one another. Paul first used phroneo to describe Yeshua's humble mindset in Philippians 2:5. But then he used it here, imploring Evodian and Syntyche to unity for the sake of the community. Paul is reminding these women that their mindset should be that of the Messiah, and calling them to put aside their wrong attitude in order to model Yeshua, who is the ultimate example. As in Philippians 2:5, we're called to have the mind of the Messiah, a mindset that led him to a life in this world of self-sacrifice, leading to the Roman cross. Paul here is calling Evodian and Syntyche, using the same Greek word, for them to have the mindset of the Messiah and to come together for their own spiritual life, but also for the spiritual life and unity of the Messianic community in Philippi. Paul's reminding these women that their mindset should be that of the Messiah, and calling them to put aside their wrong attitude in order to model Yeshua, who's their ultimate example of humility and self-sacrifice. Unity in Philippi and within any Messianic community require the people to follow the example of Yeshua and model his self-sacrificing humility. Such behavior was particularly important for leaders, such as Evodian and Syntyche, who were in a position of influence within a community. As Paul modeled the Messiah, he expected those in leadership to do the same, as leaders are to be the example of Messiah-like living. Paul is calling Evodian and Syntyche, who are in these positions of leadership, positions of notoriety, and positions of influence in the community, that they, by their disunity, by whatever issue is keeping them apart, they are giving a bad example to the people in Philippi, and that bad example could spread and bring complete disunity, and even a split of the community. As I said, as some people were saying, well, I'm on Evodia's side, I'm on Syntyche's side, and could break apart the Messianic community. But Paul here is saying, Evodian and Syntyche, I beg you to come together. You as leaders should be modeling the Messiah, and this disunity between you, this disagreement that's keeping you apart, is not modeling the Messiah. And you must, as leaders, model the Messiah. As I model the Messiah, you too, in a position of authority, position of leadership, need to model the Messiah. Paul continues in verse 3. I'll put that back on the screen, full screen. And we will move to verse 3. Verse 3 reads, I request loyal Syzygus to help these women, for they have worked hard proclaiming the good news with me, along with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers, whose names are in the book of life. Let me read that again. I request you, loyal Syzygus, help these women, for they have worked hard proclaiming the good news with me, along with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers, whose names are in the book of life. After begging Euodia and Syntyche to come together, Paul is now asking other leaders in the community, including Syzygus, to come to their aid, come to the aid of the community by bringing these women to end their dispute and to come together in unity in the community. Paul appeals to Syzygus, which Dr. Stern in his translation of the Complete Jewish Bible has as a proper name, Syzygus, which means fellow worker or companion, to help bring unity in the Philippian community by assisting Euodia and Syntyche to resolve the issues that divides them. Interesting, some translations do not use Syzygus as a proper name. For example, the English Standard Version uses the word companion, the English translation of the Greek word Syzygus, for the person Paul calls to counsel these two women. So many translations just take this word Syzygus, which means companion, and just translates companion. He calls on his companion to help to bring these women together. Dr. Stern in the Complete Jewish Bible in the Jewish New Testament takes Syzygus as a proper name, as a person in the community, a man in the community whose name means companion, to bring these women together. So we see that we see that here that this person is a person that Paul sees in that can be of help to them, and calls this individual Syzygus to come together with them, with Euodia and Syntyche, to help counsel them and to bring them into union together. Paul referred to Euodia and Syntyche as his fellow workers here, a reference to their close working relationship with Paul in ministry. Like Paul, they would have faced persecution for the commitment to the work of spreading the good news of the Messiah. So here in verse 3, we see Euodia and Syntyche referred to as fellow workers with Paul, that they had worked with Paul to bring the message of the Messiah to Philippi and throughout Macedonia. They had been working side by side with him, and they had been established as leaders in the community by their work with Paul. So Paul is calling them as fellow workers with him, as he is a committed totally to the Messiah Yeshua. He calls on them to have the same mindset that he has, a mindset fully committed to humility and self-sacrifice, and for them to have the mind of the Messiah and put aside whatever is keeping them apart, for them to come together in unity, for their personal unity together as co-workers with Paul in the work of the Messiah, but also for the health and growth and maturity of the whole Messianic community in Philippi. As leaders in the community, the lack of unity among Euodia and Syntyche affected the whole community. The whole community of Philippi was threatened by complete disunity because of these women who were in leadership were in a state of disunity. Their disunity could spread throughout the whole community. So Paul was quick to confront it here and to call these women to come together, and also calling Syzygus, who was one of the male leaders in the community, come beside them and counsel them to come together and to bring them back into unity together for the sake of the whole community in Philippi. As leaders in the community, the lack of union between Euodia and Syntyche affected the whole Messianic community. Throughout his letter, Paul calls the Philippians to unity through modeling the humility of Yeshua. And now here, as he's closing his letter, he calls for unity and humility to be among these leaders of the community, especially Euodia and Syntyche. As we've said, humility is a theme that runs throughout this whole book, the whole letter to the Philippians. The theme of humility runs from chapter 1 through now to chapter 4. And Paul here is calling these women, Euodia and Syntyche, to model the humility and self-sacrifice of Yeshua, the sacrifice and humility that Paul modeled to bring these women back together in unity, for there to be unity throughout the Messianic community, and there could be continuing growth in the community to become more and more and more in the Messiah. In addressing the conflict between these two women leaders, Paul stresses the importance of accountability for all in the Messianic community, from the leaders to everyone. So Paul here is stressing the importance for there to be accountability among the leaders in the community, that they, as the ones who are to be the models of walking in the Messiah's way, they should example that by their lives of humility, by their lives of self-sacrifice. And these two women who are in conflict are outside of that godly example, outside of that example of modeling the Messiah. So Paul here is calling them to step back into their place as being models of the Messiah for the Messianic community in Philippi, as they are co-workers with Paul, have been co-workers with him in the past, for them to return to their place as co-workers with him by modeling the humility and self-sacrifice of Yeshua, our righteous Messiah. Paul's emphasis on the importance of leaders serving examples for the Messiah is a theme throughout this letter. Just as Paul uses himself, Timothy, Epaphroditus, and Clement as examples, he also wants Evodia and Syntyche to resolve their disunity so they can be examples of Messiah to those people over which they have influence. In the opening words of this letter, in verse 1 of chapter 1, Paul addressed the congregational leaders in Shamashim, clarifying the Philippi had established leadership structure and making sure that the Philippian Messianic community leaders were listening to his message of this letter. In chapter 1, verse 1, we see Paul greeting the people in Philippi and including a special mention of the congregational leaders in Shamashim, which is something that is unique to the book of Philippians. And the other letters he doesn't refer to in the opening words. He just greets the people, greets the people in Galatia, greets people in Thessalonica. But here in the letter to Philippi, he specifically mentions the congregational leaders and the Shamashim, the elders and the deacons of the community in Philippi. Basically, with this issue in chapter 4, basically giving them a heads up from the very start of the letter. I want to be sure that the leaders in the community are listening to this letter, because there's a leadership issue that has to be dealt with in the latter part of my letter. So it's in his opening words of his letter, in his basically the initial words, he calls the people of Philippi, his brother and sister Philippi, and the leaders in the community to be listening up. Listen up, leaders. I have something important for you to see, especially here in chapter 4. There's a leadership issue that needs to be dealt with, and that was the disunity between Evodia and Syntyche. As the leaders of the community model the Messiah, their example should draw the people to follow the Messiah's example. Paul places great importance on the unity and Messiah-like modeling of leaders. It makes clear his intent to bring Evodia and Syntyche back together as one in the Messiah for their own sake, as well as the betterment of the community. Since the Philippians highly value their Roman citizenship and the prominence of Philippi as a Roman colony, Paul declares that through their faith in Yeshua, they have even greater citizenship, being written in the book of life, a citizen of heaven. We can see in this the prophetic words about the end of the days. Those left in Zion and remaining in Jerusalem will be called holy, everyone in Jerusalem written down for life. The book of life is a Jewish concept that plays a prominent role in the final judgment described in the book of Revelation. And we also see it in the High Holy Liturgy of Rosh Hashanah. So Paul here, in speaking to Evodia and Syntyche, begging them to come together, begging them to put aside whatever differences, is an issue for them as leaders to take the responsibility that they have to model the Messiah. And Paul initially in verse 2 calls Evodia and Syntyche to take this responsibility on their own, to put aside their differences put aside the issues that are holding them back from being in unity, and to follow the example of Messiah Yeshua, and to model the Messiah Yeshua, model the humility and self-sacrifice of Yeshua. And then we see in chapter 3 that he calls Syzygus and other leaders in the community to come beside them, to counsel them, to speak with them, and to call them also to join in with Paul, calling them into unity for the sake of the whole community in Philippi. So we see here the importance of the leaders in a Messianic community to model the Messiah's example of humility and self-sacrifice, which would avoid disunity, which would avoid pride in what other issues that could be holding people apart. So Paul here, as he concludes his letter to the Philippians, wants to be sure that this issue of disunity between these two leaders, Evodi and Syntyche, is dealt with for their own sake and also for the sake of the whole community, as they, as leaders, as they as examples to the community, need to model the Messiah so that not only they are becoming more and more and more in the Messiah, the whole community in Philippi is becoming more and more and more in the Messiah. And for our congregations today, it's important for those in leadership positions to be modeling the Messiah daily, to be examples of the humility and self-sacrifice of Yeshua, for their own sakes to be modeling the Messiah and becoming more and more like the Messiah each day. But for the whole Messianic community to have an example for them to model, and so as to have the whole Messianic community become more and more and more in the Messiah. And that is what Paul is calling the people of Philippi here in this section today, verses 1 through 3 of chapter 4. And by example, what we are being called to today, to understand that for there to be unity in our Messianic communities, in our synagogues, in our havaras, in our churches, there must be unity among the leadership of the community. That they are the ones who are to be modeling the Messiah to the whole community, so the whole community can stand as a light for Yeshua within a world that's getting darker and darker every day, and continue to grow to become more and more and more in the Messiah. So that will conclude our study for today as we looked at Philippians chapter 4, verses 1 through 3, and looked at the issue of disunity between Evodi and Syntyche, two leaders in the Messianic community in Philippi, and the import of them resolving their issue of disagreement for their own spiritual life, their own spiritual growth, and also for the spiritual life and spiritual growth of the whole Messianic community, of the whole congregation there in Philippi. So that will conclude our time for today. This is Letter to Philippi Live, our daily broadcast going verse by verse through Paul's letter to the Philippians. And we will continue tomorrow with a section entitled Living in Union with Messiah, looking at Philippians 4 through 6. And we'll be looking at the familiar verse 6, which says, "Don't worry about anything. On the contrary, make your requests known to God by prayer and petition with thanksgiving." And we'll look at some interesting comments from Dr. Stern on that verse. Really brought that verse even more to life to me in my studies. So tomorrow is Shabbos. On Monday, we'll be looking at living in union with the Messiah as we do this class Monday through Friday at 12 p.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Phoenix time, 2 p.m. Chicago time, 3 p.m. Winter Park time, and 10 p.m. Jerusalem time, and also found at 10 p.m. Johannesburg time. For those who are in South Africa, you can watch our shows at 10 p.m. in the evening. So that will conclude our time for today, and we will be going into Shabbat later this evening. So I give everyone in the States an early Shabbat Shalom, and have a blessed Shabbos. Our brothers and sisters in Israel and in Johannesburg are already in the Shabbat, so they're already there. Us in the States, we are still yet to enter Shabbos, and Blessed Shabbos to everyone. Shabbat Shalom. And we will see you on Monday as we continue our ongoing study here at Letter to Philippi Live, going through Paul's letter to Philippians daily, Monday through Friday, going through verse by verse through Paul's letter to the Philippians in a daily ongoing study. And thank you for watching. And if you want information on Letter to Philippi, go to lettertophilippi.org. There you can fill out our contact form, ask any questions. You can leave prayer requests. We'll be praying for you. You can purchase a copy of our Messianic commentary on Philippians on our resources page, which is the basis for this class. You can make a much needed contribution to our work. We're a nonprofit organization dependent on giving for people who watch our classes and use our materials. You can read our Messianic Jewish book reviews. We have our mission statement online. And again, if you have any questions, just fill in the contact form and I'll be happy to get back to you. And thank you for watching. Shabbat Shalom. See you on Monday as we will be looking at Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 through 6, living in union with the Messiah. Shalom, everyone, and have a blessed Shabbos.